Good morning and welcome to the third day of the 9th edition of the Delphi Economic Forum 2024. It is a great honor to be starting the day discussing global geopolitical shifts, impact and strategies for business. Also in the historic Konstantinos Karamanlis room, which was the main and one of the few rooms when the Delphi Economic Forum started back in 2016 for the old aficionados of the deaf. The interesting thing is that I'm also part of a generation that was trained to think around geopolitics as something that is a little bit behind us because it was the end of history as we were thinking for a couple of decades, only to realize that now geopolitics is at the very center. And what we will try to do today is to dissect the complexities and to focus on how businesses can navigate through what is becoming an increasingly more complex geopolitical landscape. I'm extremely honored in this discussion to have Dimitri Papalexopoulos, who is the Vice Chair of the ERT, the EU Roundtable for Industry, the Chairman of SEV, and also Chairman of Titan Cement. Dimitri, great to have you.
Thank you.
I'm also joined by Gwenaelle Avice, who is the Executive Vice President of Europe for the operations of Schneider Electric.
Thank you.
Gwenaelle, it's great to have you. Anthony Papadimitriou, the President of the Onassis Foundation. Good morning, Anthony. And also my dear friend and colleague, Nikolaus, who is the Vice Chair of the Global Advantage Practice for the Boston Consulting Group, and maybe some people were listening to him a few years ago. Now he's one of the most popular colleagues as he's navigating us through the geopolitical challenges. So we will be touching, of course, on AI, climate and sustainability, the interconnected megatrends, but the main differentiator in this distinguished group is how do the geopolitical trends affect businesses. The way we would like to start the discussion is to hear some thoughts from Nikki for 5-6 minutes and then go through the panel in order to reflect on the respective industries, how the geopolitics are affecting them. Nikki, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vassilis, and it's great to be with you today. So I'd like to start, and we're talking about geopolitics and the impact on business, I'd like to start with a little anecdote that goes back to May 2022. For those who have been there, that was the only year where Davos didn't take place in January because of COVID, but was shifted to May. And I had a coffee chat with the CEO of a global multinational company, 50 billion revenue, and he told me the following sentence. He said, well, you know, Nikolaus, if I look at my CEO agenda, 10 years ago, 2013, 14, the topic of digital and AI came on my agenda. I had to handle that in one way or the other. And then 5 years ago, climate and sustainability came to my agenda, 2017, 2018. And then on the 24th of February, geopolitics came to my agenda. And of all three themes, the last one is the one we were least well prepared to handle. And in my work with companies around the world, I very often see the fact that if you go on to geopolitics, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but there is very little view on what does it do for businesses. And let me maybe just focus on 5 topics which all have a major impact on businesses. I'll be talking first about wars and conflicts. I'll be talking about elections. I'll be talking about AI. I'll be talking about industrial policies and talent. So tackling these 5 topics in 5 minutes is a challenge, but we'll try to cover it in one way or the other. So talking about conflicts, I think what we see in the world today is a proliferation and persistence of conflicts. And I won't go into the military state of Ukraine or the Middle East, but what I want to highlight for this panel is that we see conflicts always triggering supply shocks and then inflation. So one thing which I found interesting is if you take the war in Ukraine, and the original idea was like, oh, you know, Ukraine and Russia is 2.8% of world trade, not big impact. Well, it was totally wrong, because Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus ensure 62% of the world trade in coal, 50% in pig iron, 36% in fertilizers, 25% in wheat, 20% in nickel, and I can go on like this. And if, with the sanction regime, you take out between 1/5 to half of the world trade, well, you don't need to be a genius to find out that it is a big, massive supply shock. Now the supply shock has gone down, and we are in a situation where it's more like a service shock, but it's just the example of a conflict that is generating supply shock. Another potential supply shock, as we see, is the conflict in the Middle East. With the Red Sea, we have 12% of global trade that is being forced to go around Africa. If we had a conflict with Iran, 20% of the world oil trade is going through the Strait of Hormuz, which will also be a supply shock. So the first message is geopolitical tensions generate supply shocks, which we as businesses need to handle. Then I think if we move to the second topic, which are global elections. Global elections, well, I always tend to say there are 3 numbers to remember about this year, and telling this in Greece, which is the basis of democracy, is quite interesting, is actually 73, 60, and 50. As we speak in 2024, this is the year where the human mankind will have the largest set of elections ever had. 73 countries, 60% of world GDP, 50% of world population is voting in this year. And we have had elections in Taiwan on January 13th, which went astonishingly smoothly, despite everything that was worried. We will have election in India, which I think is one of the growth and hotspots of the world. And obviously there are these elections in the US at the end of the year where everyone is kind of being very worried about what might come out or not come out. The interesting point is I leave you with the message of saying most of these elections will have fundamental impact on security systems, on immigration, on internal politics. But on the macroeconomic level, the short-term impact will be relatively limited. Third point, AI. Well, everyone is talking about AI, and AI for sure has massive economic advantages. We see this in call centers where we have 30, 40% of efficiency gains. You can reduce clinical cancer research from 9 to 3 years. That's the positive side. The negative sense is that AI is, on a global level, completely unregulated. We have EU AI Act, we have President Biden's executive order on AI, we have the Chinese provisional guidelines on AI, but there is no global order to manage this. And de facto, we are seeing a complete balkanization of the tech stack. And therefore, again, while AI has a huge potential, there is still a big risk of unregulation happening on AI. The fourth topic is industrial policies. And let me add green industrial policies. You know, in a world that Vassilis was describing, end of the world, or like Francis Fukuyama said, end of history, or the world is flat, I think we are now in a completely different world. Let me just highlight 3 or 4 industrial policies that have changed the world and are changing the world. IRA is a clearly protectionist and nationalist industrial policy aiming at strengthening manufacturing and green development in the US. CHIPS Act, obviously, is a movement that has for main purpose to have semiconductor production in the US and at the same time to limit the access of China to semiconductors. If we take the Green Deal of the EU, I think massive investment of more than 800 billion into a green technology and into a green development. But at the same time, you have the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU, which is now getting into action, which will trigger massive impact on global trade. Last but not least, on talent, I think for businesses, having talent is one of the key elements going forward. I think that when we look at different countries, there are countries that are highly successful in attracting skilled labor, US, Canada, United Arab Emirates, and there are those countries who are losing skilled labor. Interestingly enough, China, India, but also Turkey and Greece. And so I think it's really important to support governments to design possibilities to bring talent forward. So let me just summarize. Conflicts will be here for some time and will always have a supply shock risk. I think elections will happen in an unseen intensity this year, but the macroeconomic immediate impact will be relatively limited. AI has a huge economic potential, but a big risk of non-regulation. industrial policies are driving, I think, energy transition to a certain extent, but are, to a certain extent, also, of course, against global trade and against free trade. And talent is, I think, one of the least focused areas, especially for governments, because that's what we need as businesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikki, and I appreciate you for many things, but being able to explain the complexity of geopolitics in 5 minutes is one that I'm definitely grateful for. So thank you for doing this. Dimitri, I think there is a lot to comment. Elections, I think there is the European elections, so many elections that we are anticipating, I guess, quite with some anxiety. There is also what Nikki mentioned about the green industrial policy, which is touching you from a European, from a local perspective. So I wanted to get your reactions on those two, but also more broadly on what it means for the industrial sector, but also for Europe and for Greece in particular.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Indeed, what I would like to do for my contribution today to today's discussion is to bring all of this a little bit closer to home and talk a little more about Europe and, to some extent, Greece. So coming up, one of the elections that Nikki mentioned this year, of course, are the European elections in the summer. That will give us a new parliament and a new commission to take us to almost the end of the decade and all the great ambitions that we have as Europeans formulated for the end of this decade. And if you look at what these elections are about and what people are talking about, they're talking about Ukraine and the future of democracy. Understandably, it's kind of important. They're talking about populism and facing it. They're talking about climate change. They're talking about inflation and cost of living, talking about immigration. All of these are obviously extremely important topics, but what seems to be missing from this conversation is any discussion, or almost any discussion, of European competitiveness and some kind of strategy for growth in Europe. And if we go back and look at the facts and look at what the outlook, Europe has been losing competitiveness vis-a-vis not only emerging Asia, but also vis-a-vis the US for the last 25 years. And that trend, if anything, has accelerated in the last 2 or 3 years. So if you look at where we are today, all the big tech platforms, all the big technology companies are either Chinese or mostly American. There's almost nothing in Europe. Europe's claim to fame is to regulate the world through GDPR. Entrepreneurship and venture capital gravitate much more to the deeper US markets and talent pools than they do in Europe. Even when it comes to green tech, which we think we originated in Europe, most of the tech is not happening in Europe, it's happening elsewhere. The energy disadvantage that Europe already had, energy cost disadvantage, has been rendered much worse structural and long-term through the crisis in the Ukraine. And combining that with carbon pricing, which is the right thing to do, I would tell you as an economist, to save the planet and save climate, or take a step in that direction. So combining the energy costs with carbon pricing has led to an existential threat for energy-intensive industries in Europe, because we don't have a level playing field, and we do risk, as Europe, deindustrializing before we green our industry. In addition to that, as Nikki pointed out, the sort of level playing field of world competition has changed completely. There are heavy-duty industrial policies in the US and in China, among other places, and Europe finds itself in a difficult position trying to choose between defending the traditional free trade order, from which it has traditionally benefited, almost to the point of seeming naive sometimes, and on the other hand, adapting and saying, I cannot be the only innocent in the house. If you look at that has led to, foreign direct investment in the US is up 60% in the last 3 years. It is down 60% in Europe in the last 3 years. We have become, for the first time in a century, a net importance of chemicals. We used to produce 30% of the world's aluminium. Now we produce 5% of the world's aluminium, and the list goes on. And if you look at the next generation of challenges coming up with AI, challenges both in the good sense and the bad, again, I thoroughly agree with Nikki, somebody has to regulate AI, but could we as Europe please do something more than participate in the regulatory aspects? We're not leading again. So looking ahead, I'm afraid my bleak outlook does not get any better. There are more headwinds. Whether we like it or not, defense spending will have to rise, and rise significantly. The green energy transition has turned up being much more expensive than we anticipated. It's the right thing to do, but it's expensive, with a lot of upfront costs and a lot of infrastructure, digital also. The demographics of Europe are also not very attractive. And as Nikki pointed out, geopolitics has not ceased to surprise us. Let's see what other surprises it comes up with. So all of this is not to say in any way that is in any way anti-EU. If anything, we need more Europe and better Europe, not less Europe. And it also is not saying we are hopeless. We have as Europe great quality of life, great human capital, and we have strengths on which to build. But we cannot do so without addressing competitiveness head-on. Economic growth in Europe is an absolute prerequisite in order to fund our ambitions. Now, what can be done? For those of you who want a sort of punchy document to talk about that, the Antwerp Declaration, signed by over 1,000 companies in February, I think has some pretty good recommendations. I think we're all waiting for the Draghi report sometime later this spring to help us out. And there are no easy solutions, but we have to double down on the basics, on the single market, on upskilling, on innovation capacity and infrastructure. We have to find that right balance between defending the liberal world order and open trading, but being more hard-nosed versus the rest of the world, and not automatically accepting the loss of industry to principle. We have to rethink the mix of energy and climate policies without diluting our climate ambition. Stopping our climate ambition is not the solution. And we need to change a mindset as Europe to regulate and over-specify less and think more in terms of enabling, helping, assisting entrepreneurship and business provide solutions that only they can. And if you give me another 1.5 minutes, what does that all mean?
Positive 1.5 minutes, please.
Well, that's, so what does all this mean for our country, for Greece? Now, for Greece, the next 3 years are much better than average for the EU. Greece is an island of stability in a sometimes crazy world. The structure of our economy makes us less vulnerable in some ways, and the reforms of the last few years are certainly helping. Financing is available, a pipeline of projects is full, the confidence has come back, and that helps in a number of ways inside and outside the country. Tourism is doing well, shipping is doing well, parts of industry, big parts of industry are doing well. But this should not lull us into a false sense of security. The longer-term risks in demographics, lack of skills, debt, lack of critical mass in global-sized companies, we need to move a lot faster. Compared to the changes around us and the speed at which they're happening, compared to what other countries are doing, we're not moving fast enough. We have a golden opportunity, and I believe we can and should take it, to move ahead. The opportunities, if we act forcefully, are there, as are the risks if we don't. So, to summarize, competitiveness is not a sexy word politically. It does not win elections, but improving it, whether for the EU or for Greece, is crucial in positioning us in a world with many uncertain trends.
So thank you, Dimitri. On the second round, I will ask you that you focus on the positive messages, and I will challenge you to say, we still have 2 months. I heard yesterday that it's 2 months to the European elections, how we can bring the Antwerp report, the Draghi report, and the opportunities to the broader European populace so that it can really help the dialogue. Coming to Gwenaelle, Schneider Electric, first of all, what is good is, one, of the few companies that figure in the different competitiveness reports and European-based multinationals with a global footprint, which also has many of the trends that Nikki discussed on AI and sustainability embedded in its strategy. What does this geopolitical complexity mean for Schneider Electric?
Well, thank you for the question, and I would like to take the opportunity also to respond to some of the comments that were made. First, so we are a technology company. We are a technology company focused on electrification, focused on digitization, focused on automation. You know, we were saying that we are suffering in Europe because of competitiveness difference with the US, with other geographies, because of geopolitics, because our dependence on the energy matter, and that's right. That's right. For example, you know, we spend in Europe 1 billion a day for imported energy, 1 billion a day. If we were more Europe for Europe, with more renewable energy, with more digitization, with more energy efficiency, then we would spend this money in a different way for the energy transition. I just want to say that because at the end of the day, it's not a fatality, the positioning in Europe. At Schneider Electric, you know, we have been positioned on sustainability for the past 15 years. Look at our share price. You know, it has increased dramatically. It means that sustainability, electrification, digitalization is good business. It's where we can differentiate. So when we say there is no fatality, yes, we can be a tech company in Europe. Yes, we can make money in Europe. And how to differentiate? It's sustainability. That's where we started the journey a long time ago in Europe. That's where we are ahead of the curves versus competition, versus the Americans, versus the rest of the world, and that's positive. That's where we need to think about differentiation. Sometimes we see Europe as a very complex organization, but look at the numbers. This year was a record year for renewable energy in Europe. Fossil fuel were down, and at the same time, renewable energy was up. Here in Greece, it's the same, 57% of renewable energy. So we have to think about it and how to leverage on it. And when it comes to, you know, the role of digitalization around that, it's all about reinforcing, strengthening what makes us different. Again, if we want to go into sustainability, it will be a mix. 50% of the equation is greening the supply. 50% of the equation is working on a demand. What does it mean? Electrification, energy efficiency. 50-50. It's not only renewable energy, it's also the rest of the equation. And honestly, we have good targets. The biggest problem that we have in Europe is that we are good at setting targets, we are less good at implementing the targets. That's why my vision for Europe is wake-up call on action, not only on big targets and pledges and all that. This is already happening, but turn that into reality. And to do that is working together. We are a tech company. We need the utilities to invest into the digitization of the grid. We need the utilities and the EPC companies to develop more renewable energy. We need the data centers players that are investing into Europe in order to have green data centers. We need to work with the industry to electrify the industry in Europe. So it's a set of segments, you know, across the board that we have to convince to go in that direction. And basically, the megatrends are there to stay in Europe. That's where we need to focus. When I say they are here to stay, it means that data centers with AI will continue and will increase investment in Europe, and that's positive. All data centers development, it's positive. It's more resiliency because then it's Europe for Europe. When it comes to power and grid, it will be more renewable for Europe. Again, more Europe for Europe. And when it comes to digitalization, it's reducing our bills. More energy efficiency. We consume less energy because thanks to digitalization. Again, more Europe for Europe. The message is that there is no fatality. We can be a tech company in Europe and be well-performing, focusing on what makes us different. And what makes us different is sustainability through the drivers on electrification and digitalization and automation. That's a good way to position Europe in front of the other geographies and stay ahead of the curve?
Thank you, Gwenaelle. I have to say, negative start. Then
balance.
you picked up positive. Now Gwenaelle is building up, so I hear more Europe for Europe. Regionalization, less imported energy. We like that a lot. Single market, what Dimitri said. So we are in a crescendo. Adoni, I hope you will continue on this now, uplift that Gwenaelle brought us. Onassis Foundation, from one hand, let's say the shipping business, how it is impacted. Secondly, from your unique footprint on the social domain, how it is impacted by those geopolitical trends.
First of all, Vassilis, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's a good opportunity for me to talk about the business side of the Onassis Foundation. A lot of people recognize what we are doing in the social sphere, the scholarships, the cultural center, the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. But all this is funded by the profits we are making on the business. This is the genius of Mr. Onassis, that we are spending only 40% of the profits of a business. And that business, we continue to run 50 years after the passing away of Mr. Onassis. A large part of that business is shipping, has been shipping and will hopefully remain shipping. Shipping has been good for us. So a lot of my time is thinking about what we are going to do in shipping. And shipping is part of the logistics chain. And it is definitely clearly influenced by trade flows. So shipping investment is a very long-term proposition. A lot in by what Dimitri is doing. You are also investing for the long term. So you order a ship today, the ship will be delivered in 3 years, meaning in 2028, and that ship will live until 2048 or even more than that. And we're reaching then into the climate change targets. So you're ordering a ship today that should be resilient, sustainable, or call it what you want, in up to until 2048. And there is not, the technology does not exist to that today. That's a big issue. So similar to, 2 years ago, here in Delphi, we had a quite interesting panel about the shipping of the future. What ships are we going to have in the future? What these ships will be carrying and what these ships will be using as a fuel? And there is no question. I will be with Dimitri here. I'm not very optimistic about finding a solution in the next 2 to 3 years in order to be able to order the ships that will sustain the trade flows in the future. So that's an interesting challenge we all have. The other thing I wanted to say is that the trade flows are impacted in a lot of ways. One of them, which people tend to forget, is demography. So I'll give you one fun fact. For the last 40 years, the world has been using 2 liters, or a little bit more than 2 liters, of oil per capita. Except that 40 years ago, we had 4.2 billion people, and now we have 8.4. So 4 billion people are still consuming 2 liters of oil per day. And we are looking into the future to add another 2 billion of people that will also consume 2 liters per day. And that's not taking into account the Americans that are consuming much more than 2 liters of oil per day. Where are these 2 billion people coming? They are coming in the less developed world. And these people in the less developed world will consume, in fact, more oil than the average. So that's a big challenge regarding where is this oil going to be procured, and what is the impact on climate change. So if you look at the details of the demography of the world in a very high level, it's a big topic. You have the developed world where demography is stable, so you have, let's say, a square, more or less the same, depending on the country. China, which, as you mentioned, Nikki, yesterday, is in a demographic trap. They are very educated, they are very sophisticated, they are very proud, they are very patient, but they are also very aging, very aging. That's an issue. And they are consuming. They are consuming a lot. In China, there are 500 million people that consume, on average, as much as a European. The same applies with India, where India is a young, educated, and aspiring population. They aspire to consume more. Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, that's another 2.5 billion people. If these people, 2.5 billion people, consume per capita as much energy, grain, or whatever, as India, not as China, as India, is going to be a huge change in trade flows, huge change. And again, we don't know what's the climate impact of this, and where are this grain, this protein, this oil, these chemicals, where are they going to be produced? And what's the impact? Third point, energy consumption. I touched upon it. People are talking about as a need to have new fuels, etc. Well, there are no new fuels. I have to say it. There are no new fuels. People are talking about ammonia, methanol, etc. Well, the cost per unit of energy is 10 times as it is the cost in traditional fuels. And the other thing is that all greenhouse gases must be taken into account. When you burn ammonia, even if there was enough quantity of ammonia to be produced, which there isn't, even if enough ammonia is produced in the world for shipping, transportation, what you name it, ammonia produces other greenhouse gases. It produces nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, particulate matter, and in order to burn ammonia, you still need a small quantity, but important, of diesel. Hydrogen. It's a very good fuel. It's very expensive. It's impossible today. For the next 5 to 10 years, we won't have it. So where are we going to procure the energy we need to decarbonize? So that's, again, I'm not very optimistic on that side. The politicians are overreaching, the regulators are overreaching, they're imposing solutions. These solutions will create competitive disadvantages to the world, and the rest of the world actually doesn't follow. And I'm coming to the other demographic factor, which is that Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, 2.5 billion people, they tell us, and Latin America, by the way, they tell us, the developed world, well, you created this mess, and you are asking us to take the cost of decarbonization. That's a political issue. We need to take care of that. Last point, demographics and different attitudes to technological changes. So people are talking about AI. Well, AI is not the only digital revolution that's happening. There are a lot of other digital revolutions. There are a lot of other revolutions that are happening. Battery storage, energy storage, the smart grid, procuring everything electric, to your point, Ben. Everything electric. These are items where the rest of the world may leapfrog the developed markets. So one of the areas in the world which has the highest penetration of mobile banking is Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has 90% penetration, some areas, not all of them, 90% penetration of mobile banking. So they may leapfrog over us. They have a problem. Data centers, when you mentioned that, data centers are extremely energy consuming. So you have, in order to have a data center in Sub-Saharan Africa, you need to procure the energy, you need to have the workforce, you need to have the skills to do that. Where are they going to happen? So that's a problem. because we are facing, looking forward to the future, we are facing a situation where we have a divide, a poverty gap in digital services, in the digital economy, in certain areas in the world. And lastly, different changes for climate change, ESG. I thought, Vassilis, you would mention these famous words. These were the words that were in everybody's agenda, every businessman's agenda about a couple of years ago, even a year ago. Today, this year, nobody's talking about ESG. And there is a reason for that, because ESG doesn't seem to be a proposition that is working for investment, either as an investment in ESG or as a filter for your own investments. Again, that's a problem because we do need ESG. I'm in favor of ESG, but I'm just pointing in this educated audience, I'm pointing to the fact that ESG as an economic reality has its own issues. So I hope I left you...
No, I take the, let's say, undisputed positive messages, which is the growth potential coming from the emerging world, the fact that it is an opportunity for Europe in order to support this emerging world in topics like energy, procurement for data centers, etc. I hear also there is more pragmatism needed on the green transition, especially given the lack of an alternative to hydrocarbon, at least in the short term. Now, we have only 3 minutes left, so I will go back to my ask to Dimitris, the 1-minute version of the positive messages that we can bring to the broader European population on the opportunities in Europe, in order to maybe give some positive feedback to our politicians who are out campaigning already, hopefully for Europe, and that's around Europe.
Just as a clarification, I was not pessimistic. It was a call for action more than pessimism. And I think
how do we bring it to the broader
Schneider
population?
Electric is a very good example of a company that has adapted a strategy to turn lemons into lemonade, and more of us need to do that. I will focus on 2 examples. I will use my Titan hat and my Greek hat rather than my European hat. As Titan, we are in a very energy-intensive carbon emissions industry, and we have turned the mindset switch on to turn that problem, that challenge, into an opportunity by a green growth strategy. And how we translate that into reality is a subject for a different panel. And in terms of Greece, I would argue that rather than thinking big picture about AI in the future of the universe, if we use AI to rethink the public sector in Greece, we could make a huge leap forward very quickly.
Thank you, Dimitri. Avice, now you need to say how Titan has done great.
Thank you. No, just maybe sometimes in Europe we think that regulation is hampering business because it's a lot of elements altogether. I think that we can turn that into an opportunity of differentiation again. In the past few years with the last European Commission, lots have been done. European Green Deal, Energy Efficiency Directive for buildings, but also Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Because of this directive, this topic of sustainability is at the agenda of all executive committee members and board members at the European Union level for companies. And this is positive. So let's use regulation to turn that into opportunities of differentiation and not just talk, but action.
Thank you, Gwenaelle. And Adoni, the last word is yours.
Well, I do have a positive comment, and that is that Greece has, I think, a very good opportunity in front of it in the challenges that we have just outlined. We are starting, for once, at the same level as everybody else. We have the talent, we have the skills, we have the educated population to work for the digital revolution and in competing for sustainability within Europe. So this is a great opportunity for Europe, starting for once, as I said, on the same level as many other countries, to rise to the challenge.
Thank you, Adoni, and I hope, Nikki, we have fed you with enough positive angles to your narrative around geopolitics. So let's turn European regulation that everybody is really fighting against into an opportunity on energy efficiency, on an opportunity to differentiate. Let's also think of how AI can be an opportunity for Greece. And let's also think that it's not only challenges, but also opportunities even in the hardest to abate sectors like cement on green growth strategy. So I think it's great that we are concluding this panel on a positive note. And it's really a great pleasure to discuss with all of you.
You fought for it.
Thank you.